Hello, welcome to Sociology 103, Introduction to Sociology. And today we're going to be talking about Chapter 13, which is the social institution of family. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, let's look at the myth that we've been fed literally our whole lives, which is that the family unit is mom, dad, and children. However, this paradigm has not been true for the majority of us for many, many decades. So let's go back to the 1980 census, where approximately 42% of households included married parents with children. So we're still looking at less than half of the families that, submit information to the Census Bureau were actually married with children at home. In 2010, that number had shrunk to 34%. So literally almost a third of the people in this country live in the fairy tale existence, whereas the vast majority of us are outside of that fairy tale. So let's define what a family is. And that is the primary group of people, usually related by ancestry, marriage, or adoption, who form a cooperative economic unit. And that's the important phrase, cooperative economic unit, to care for one another over a long period of time. So family is a social institution that changes in response to social conditions. So for example, up until the 1950s, divorce was not very prevalent, but it started to increase around that era, and it continued to increase until the 1980s, and it has since began to decline because less people are getting married. But the point is that family is ever changing. It's dynamic. It is going to change from the time you are your age today to 20 years from now to 40 years from now. Family is not static, and static is defined as unmoving. So you have to remember this idea of dynamic. Within families, we have these things called kinship systems, which, if you've ever studied anthropology, are very, very popular topics of discussion. And these are the relationships that define people's interactions with one another within a family. So the parameters include how many marriage partners are permitted at the same time. In the United States, the standard is you get one at a time. However, in certain religions like Islam, there is the possibility of having up to 4 wives. And if you go to a country like Saudi Arabia, this is not all that unusual. However, in the United States, because we have this one spouse law, they often will call their second, third, or fourth spouses spiritual wives. Then who is permitted to marry whom? In some cultures, you have people whose parents expect to choose their marriage partner. In other cultures, it's that whole meeting somebody, dating them asking you to marry them, and that's how it goes. How property is passed on. In previous centuries, a lot of times you saw only the oldest son getting the property. And women couldn't own property because legally they weren't seen as being able to manage property. So, obviously those kinds of systems have changed dramatically. Where the family lives. Again, in previous centuries, a girl who married would have to go live with her in-laws. That was the standard. And then lastly, how power is distributed within the family. So in a lot of families, dad is in charge, and in a lot of families, mom is in charge. And these kinship systems are really based on the culture of the family as well as the changes in society. So then we have the concept of the marriages that are available. We have something called polygamy, which is the practice of a man or woman having multiple marriage partners. In the United States, we have a television show called sister wives. And this is the stud muffin and then his 4 wives. And they belong to a group of fundamentalist Mormons who refute the idea that the Mormon leadership was correct in banning polygamy marriages. So, this guy is still all about having multiple wives. If it is involved with a man having multiple wives, it's called polygyny. If, on the other hand, it's the practice of a woman taking multiple husbands, it's polyandry. But this is very rare, and you only see it when there is a serious lack of women around, and men need to have a partner, so they are sometimes willing to share a woman with another man. Then in the United States, the standard is monogamy, which is the practice of a marriage with one spouse at a time and maintaining sexual exclusivity, meaning you're faithful. And I know Jay-Z and Beyonce have some rumors floating around about him and Rihanna. However, in terms of a monogamous couple, they're kind of one of the more famous married celebrity couples. People who divorce their spouse and remarry someone else are practicing what we call serial monogamy, meaning they go from spouse to spouse, never cheating, but not sticking around for the long haul either. Then we have something called patrilineal kinship, and this is the norm in Western societies, to trace descendants through one's father. And this is why, socially, it is the norm for a wife to take her husband's last name and for their children to have the father's last name. Prior to the 20th century, it also meant, as I mentioned before, that the wife would move to where her husband lives, sometimes living with his family. So, for those of you who are not married, who will you marry? And for those of you who are married, maybe some of this will seem vaguely similar to your own experience. So, in general, Americans tend to marry people who have the same socioeconomic class position. So somebody who's in the middle class generally marries somebody who's in the middle class. And somebody who is in the working class will marry someone who's in the working class. The same race, the same religion. And that becomes extremely important because when you have children, if you don't belong to the same religious institution, there can be conflict about how you'll raise the children. And then finally, the same educational background. And this is due largely in part to the fact that many of us might meet our potential spouse in college, or we work at a job where the minimum academic requirement requires us to work with people who have the same academic requirement. Now, despite the popularity of interracial marriages in terms of what we see with sports and celebrities, only about 4% of married couples in the United States are interracial marriages. Asians and Hispanics are more likely to marry outside their race than whites and African Americans. And you'll see here on the right, that is Mr. Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook, and his lovely wife, Dr. Patricia Chan, who is, of course, somebody from the Asian descent. So some really interesting research has been done on interracial relationships because over the last 20 years they have become much more the norm than the exception in terms of young people. And what they find is that college-educated African Americans are less likely to date outside their race. Black men are more likely to date outside their race than white women, and whites are the least likely to date outside their race. And then the other thing is, although society has gotten better about interracial dating or marriage, families still have a lot of disapproval. And I think in some ways this comes down to, what the grandchildren are going to look like for the family. If you're a white family and your child comes out dark brown, that lack of identifying characteristics can make people feel that the child doesn't really belong with them. On the other hand, you have groups that, if a white girl and a black man get together and the child comes out white, which is possible, especially if the black guy has some white grandparents or great-grandparents in his bloodline. Again, the African American family might feel that that child doesn't really belong with them. So there's a lot of conflict, and a lot of these things are working their way through the system. And ultimately, you should always be on the right side of history, accept, not reject. So as we spoke at the beginning of this PowerPoint, we were looking at how a nuclear family is defined as mom, dad, and their children. Many of us grew up in what we called the extended family, with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins assisting in caring for the children, or, spending weekends with grandpa and grandma. And then there's the other kind of extended family, which is called fictive kin. And these are family members who are not related by blood or marriage, but who are considered part of the family. So, for example, your mom's best friend or your dad's best friend, somebody who's been there your whole life, and you might have thought that they were an actual uncle or aunt for a while, but it doesn't negate the relationship to you because there's no blood involved. Relationships are socially constructed. So if someone is close enough to you to call them uncle, then that's them. Now, before the advent of industrialization in urban areas in the 1800s, most families engaged in agricultural labor, with all members of the family contributing to the well-being of the household. So if you grew up on a farm, from the time you could walk, you were given jobs, whether it was to get the eggs from the chickens, help dad milk cows, keep an eye out for the fence, walk the fence line to make sure that there was no breaks in the fence. So everybody contributed. And what you saw then is that there was a general feeling that equity was involved in the relationships. However, after the industrialized period began, families shifted to living in urban areas, cities, with dad working in a factory, and he became the breadwinner. And this resulted in women becoming economically dependent upon men, which in a lot of ways we're still dealing with some of these repercussions today, where the men are supposed to go out and work and the women are supposed to stay home and take care of the kids. And the reality of our economic situation is that that's not going to always be possible, because a lot of families need both parents to work to maintain a living wage. So when we talk about families and we look at the sociological theories involved, let's start with functionalism. So the family meets the needs of society to reproduce and socialize children. It also creates stability. It teaches people the norms and values of society. They are organized around the similarities shared by the family members. And they experience breakdown when society undergoes rapid social change, otherwise known as social disorganization. And again, the growing acceptance of divorce from the 50s through the 1980s really demonstrated this breakdown of the traditional family unit and how it became, again, this dynamic, ever-changing experience. Within the conflict theorists, they believe that families reinforce and support power relationships in society. So, if dad is in charge, it is mom's job to make sure the kids realize and accept that dad is in charge. Instill the norms and values that are consistent with the needs of a dominant institution or group, such as obedience, likelihood to submit to authority, and the desire for products, especially in a capitalist society. So from the time we're little, we're told to listen and obey mom and dad, and if a police officer or a doctor tells you something, you should respect them, and that at Christmas, you need to get the old guy to bring you as much loot as possible. So we are breeding a group of consuming, obedient, submissive sheep. Oh, wait, I didn't say that. The struggles that society contends with occur within the family, leading to conflict and change. In symbolic interaction theories, the family unit emerges to meet basic needs and develop meaningful long-term relationships. Marriage is a social construction which society sees as the preferred state, and this has not always been the case. Not until 800, when Charlemagne took over the Holy Roman Empire, was marriage a really important dynamic. And it became an important dynamic because of civil properties and the idea of, if someone is to to inherit wealth, who's going to get it? And, what's a legitimate child versus an illegitimate child? It also provides an opportunity to learn and develop one's identity through interacting with their family. And family is where we learn negotiation in terms of expectations and relationships. Some families are yellers. They love to yell and scream and throw fits about things. Other families are very quiet and they suppress everything. So, how we learn to interact with our family carries through for many of us for the rest of our lives. And change leads to new forms of family life. So, when we think today of a gay couple adopting a child, this is a new paradigm in the family world. Now, I'm also going to be discussing feminist theory in terms of family because it's pretty applicable here. And more importantly, as a woman, one must look at their place in the family and see how it was used to our benefit or used against us. So families, according to the feminist theory, are institutions that reflect the gender hierarchy in society. So in some families, the men eat first and then the women eat whatever's left. In other cultures, the men eat in one room and they get steak, and the women eat in another room and they get rice and beans. So, we become immune to the absurdity because it's part of our lives. It promotes gender socialization, demands a power imbalance between men and women, and change results in the evolution of equality within families. So again, what we see here is that change leads to equality and not conflict. So we have to look at all four of these theories as a way to truly embrace the idea of what a family is meant to do. So let's look at family conditions today. Families are smaller. They average about 3.5 people per household, which doesn't mean we're cutting kids in half, but rather when you average it all out. Parents are choosing to have fewer children, and they're choosing how to space out the births. So 100 years ago, before birth control really hit, you might see a lot of families with 8, 9, 10 children. Whereas today, most people are choosing 2, maybe 3, and they're choosing to space out the births every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, rather than every year. People are also living longer, which means parenting is a smaller percentage of one's lifespan, which also means something like the idea that in 1900 the average lifespan was 40, and today it's around 78. So, back then parenting was half your life. Now it's about a quarter of your life. Also, divorce is more common, which has led to a high percentage of single-parent households. And you'll see with this chart that divorce really started to take off in the mid-60s and kind of plateaued in 1980, and it's been coming down slowly ever since. But, these divorces have led to a high percentage of single-parent households. Married couples with children make up approximately half the households in the United States. Families are spending more time being caretakers for their elderly family members than they did raising their children. So if your mom and dad had you at 25 and you move out when you're 20 and they're 45, they've probably got a good 35 years left to live. And you may be the one schlepping them to and from the doctors and all that other stuff as they get older. Additionally, the median age at first marriage has also skyrocketed. So in 1960, your average boy was almost 23 and your average girl was 20. Now, in about 2010, the last census, the first marriage 28 and a half and girls are 26 and a half. So what we're really seeing is almost a 6-year increase over the 6 decades that's being measured. And again, what you're looking at here is the trend line probably going to plateau at some point, because a lot of people who get married want to have children, and it's always healthier to have children before you're 40. 25% of households are headed by a single parent, and of that number, 87% live with their moms. African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to live in a single-parent household. Many of these households exist because of divorce, or a parent dies, a parent goes to jail, a parent gets deployed. I mean, there's any number of reasons why someone would be raising their children alone. But the majority of these women are women who gave birth when they were young, often as teens, and didn't marry the father. So they don't have that secondary support in their life. So by now you should know that we should look at research to see what is really going on so we can debunk myths. One of the myths that politicians love to spout off about is the reason that children are so out of control is because single mothers don't have a male figure to properly discipline the child. And so, of course, we're blaming mom. However, what the research is showing is that these problems are caused by economic pressures faced by single mothers. If you have to work 2 full-time jobs just to put the food on the table and pay the rent, it's very hard to control your children. In single mother households, approximately 30% live below the poverty line. And we discuss this in great detail with the feminization of poverty in Chapter 8. And what you'll see is that people who are single and uneducated have a higher chance of being poor than somebody with education and who's married. Approximately 40% of marriages involve stepchildren, and the challenges for stepfamilies include transitioning to a blended family, the new roles that emerge within the family, the children's status changing with new additions, such as going from being an only child to being a middle child with 2 step-siblings. And then probably the most challenging aspect is adjusting to new and different parenting styles. If your mom is real lackadaisical and your new dad is much more authoritarian, that's going to cause some conflict, which unfortunately results in the probability of divorce within marriages involving stepchildren is much higher than couples without stepchildren. Another recent thing we've seen in the news a lot is the idea of gay and lesbian households, and it's still a very small minority of families in the U.S. Research has found that gay parents tend to be more flexible in terms of household expectations, and the power dynamic is more balanced. Parenting is more collaborative. We're not getting sucked into the gender roles that we learned from our mom and dad. So children who are raised in a gay household have similar outcomes in terms of lifetime success, academic achievement, social interactions, etc., to those children raised in heterosexual households. These children are no more likely to be gay than the societal average. Gay parents don't make gay children. On the other hand, They do tend to suffer teasing about their household, but grow up to be more accepting of diversity, which of course many of us see as a good thing. So we've been talking about married people for the past 20 minutes, so let's talk about some single people. Single people represent approximately half the population in the U.S., and being single means you've never been married, which is about a third of the population over the age of 15, people who are divorced or separated, or who have been widowed. The benefits to staying single include tending to exercise more and stay in shape, because even though you're single, you're still looking for companionship. And more importantly, staying single means you have more life choices. You're more flexible. So if you are single and you are planning on going on vacation to Guatemala, and someone says, forget Guatemala, come with me to Italy, it's way more fun. You can do that without having to consult your partner. However, studies do show that married people live longer, so at some point, I'm sure all of these people will get married. Research shows that the form of the family does not predict happiness or dysfunction. Form meaning, is there mom and dad? Is there dad and dad? Is there mom and mom? Is it just mom, just dad? Is it aunt or grandma raising you? It doesn't matter. What really matters are the next 4 ideas. 1, economic resources. Doesn't mean you're going to be happy if you're wealthy, but it does make life easier. 2, domestic violence and conflict. If there is domestic violence or constant conflict in the household, there's going to be a lot of anxiety. Stress and poor coping skills. If your children see that when dad is pissed off or stressed out, he drinks, that is their interpretation of how to deal with stress. Whereas if they see mom who's stressed out and annoyed about something, doing some yoga or listening to music or dancing, that's going to be a much more productive way of handling stress. And finally, the support provided outside of the immediate family. Does mom or dad have extended family who can help? Do they have fictive kin who can help? Do they have the support of their neighbors, their community? So we look at these family patterns, and the form itself is irrelevant as long as the kids are in a happy, safe environment. Now, in terms of courtship, which involves dating or getting to know someone, these have changed significantly over the 20th century and early 21st century. 67% of couples live together before they get married today, which, is a good thing in the sense that, if you can live with someone, kind of the try before you buy idea. And, maybe that's part of the reason why the divorce rate is coming down a little. Instead of dating, many people prefer to hook up. And, hook up means meeting someone or going out as a group and people partnering up. About 40% of college women admit to engaging in this specific activity. And when we say hook up, that doesn't necessarily mean have sexual intercourse. It may mean kissing. It may mean some, groping. It may mean just hanging out. But for people to get to know one another, the paradigm has changed because we no longer see a lot of young people one-on-one go out together. More and more young people are using a dating website and hookup sites. The hookup site Tinder claims to have 50 million active users, and that is a huge number of single people swiping right and left. Then we have something called the boomerang generation, which is a growing number of single people who are remaining at home with their parents for longer periods. 1/3 of young people between the ages of 25 and 34 live with their parents. And they do this for a lot of different reasons. Oftentimes it's financial. The young person can save money to buy a house when they are in their 30s. It allows people to finish college without having to spend money on an apartment or a dorm room. And, when you have a relationship with someone and it ends, especially if it ends badly, you want to go home and you want to have mom make you chicken soup and look after you because you have to cry for 3 days. The reality here is that, kids, no matter how much we fight with our parents, we still love our parents for the most part. And they are our comforting area, our safe space. So let's look at some trends in marriage. Most Americans, about 95%, will enter into a marriage or long-term relationship in their lifetime. Now, the 5% who generally don't fall on either end of the continuum of education. So people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, generally, although not, exclusively, don't get married. I mean, there are some young people who are married who live in a facility, but they provide companionship to one another. On the other hand, you have a lot of people who spend the vast majority of their youth in college getting their master's and PhD, and by the time they're done and really ready to look around to get married, everyone in their peer group is already partnered up. So, the amount of money a person makes determines their power within the marriage. And this includes the decision making, the level of independence they enjoy, and the expectations on each person within the family. And of course, 64% of the time, it's the husband who makes more than the wife. And this number is shifting, but it's still holding pretty steady. So basically, if you're an older guy with money, you can get a younger woman. And you get to make all the choices and the decisions because she is economically dependent upon you. While husbands and wives share more of these duties when both work, the duties of housework and childcare, the vast majority of the work is still done by the women. African American men are more likely to help with the household tasks than white men. And Hispanic men are more likely to shoulder an equal burden of housework and childcare than any other race. So, and again, a lot of this stuff is cultural. And we as a society have to accept that there's certain cultural paradigms that just take longer to overcome. Divorce rates are high, but they've been slowly dropping since 1980. Couples who are most likely to get divorced are young people, so someone who marries at 18 or 19, people who've been married less than 5 years. In the first 5 years, the first year or two, you're still in your thrall of, you're having sex all the time, you're enjoying playing house, and then, things get a little bit more difficult and challenging as you get older. And oftentimes you see people not willing to commit to putting up with someone else for a lifetime. People who are on their second, third, or fourth marriages, and low-income couples. And the reason that the divorce rates are so high is there's nothing to split for these people. Whereas somebody who's in the middle or upper classes, they have assets. And if you divorce, you have to split those assets. So a lot of times people will just stick with a relationship hoping that it'll get better because they don't want to lose money in the divorce. Research also shows that it's better to get a divorce than stay married for the children if the relationship is contentious. Children being in a stressful environment is only going to induce more anxiety. So the more amicable the divorce can be, the easier it will be for the children to adjust. And that's very important. Parents have to be grown-ups in this and not put their kids in the middle. So one of the big issues in the United States and elsewhere is domestic violence. It's very hard to quantify the statistics because so much domestic violence goes unreported. The Centers for Disease Control estimate that 33% of women will be raped, assaulted, or stalked by a partner in their lifetime. That's 1 in 3 women. So why don't the women leave? And some women do leave, but some women don't. And the reasons are various, but the main ones, they love their spouse and believe that he really does want to change. They have very few options to escape and support themselves and their children financially. And that's a big one. Imagine living the middle-class lifestyle. You have a house, you have a car, you have beautiful things, your kids are at a nice school, your husband beats you, and if you leave, you're going to end up living in a shelter. And a lot of times people don't do what they should do, which is leave, but really just put up with it for the sake of their children. Another common element is that the spouse threatens to hunt them down and kill them and their children if they leave. So inspiring that terrorism or that fear is just horrifying. And, when women endure this, they do encounter that Stockholm syndrome, where they come to believe that this is because they're bad wives and bad partners and bad spouses, so they deserve the abuse. Now, men are abused, but not to the same extent that women are. So, I want to recognize that, but it's really not at the level that women are abused. Child abuse is behavior that puts children at risk and may involve physical violence, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. And if you look at that chart over here on the right-hand side, and this is from 2012, the cases of neglect are absolutely astronomical. Physical, sexual, psychological maltreatment, they're all in the 10 to 20% range, but neglect is almost 80% of the cases. In 2010, 3.6 million children were reported to Child Protective Services at least once in the United States. That's 1% of the population, being put in a situation where they're abused. In terms of numbers, white children are more likely to be abused, but when you look at the percentages of the racial demographics, African American and Hispanic children are abused at a higher rate. Men and women abuse children equally, so it's not just a male thing. Men are more likely to hit their spouse, and women are often take their anger and frustration out on their children. So who abuses children? People who are chronic alcohol users. If you are drunk, you tend to have a lower threshold of tolerance for people's behavior. Unemployed, if someone is isolated and lack a support system, there are specific cultural norms. Adrian Peterson is a football player who was sanctioned for beating his son with, I forget if it was a belt or a switch. And to him, he apologized. He said that that's how he grew up. And for a lot of people, growing up with a parent who, spanks you or uses a belt on you can make it normal. And as such, something has to happen for you to find out that it's not normal. And that takes us to the 30% of abusers were abused as children. So it's, again, a learned behavior. Immature and lacking patience, and then impatient or impulsive is really the word to look at. Just unable to think about their actions before they lash out. Finally, what happens to abused children when they grow up? 80% of young adults who were abused as children manifest mental disorders, including anxiety, depression, and personality disorders. Adults who were victims of child abuse also suffer more chronic illnesses like diabetes and asthma, and they suffer from weight problems because they probably are emotional eaters. They lack trust, so they have a hard time maintaining long-term relationships. They have low self-worth, low self-efficacy, which basically means low self-confidence. And they often suffer from substance abuse because they're trying to self-medicate or numb their feelings. So, as a potential parent or an actual parent, you always have to be aware of the fact that what you do in terms of disciplining your children will have a lifetime effect. And, even though sometimes you want to smack a kid so hard they feel it next year, it's the wrong thing to do, and we have to find better ways to manage the misbehavior of the kids so that they don't learn that violence is the answer. So that finishes this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.